film needs to be called Civil Snore. Not because it's boring, no, but because it didn't have me fighting with myself about plot holes, missed opportunities and problems. I went home after seeing it and I slept real deep like. Civil War suffers from the curse of just being really good. It's well written, well directed, and well acted, but most of all, it's well put together. I watched a Looper video titled 4 Huge Plot Holes in Civil War, and I commented that the definition of a plot hole is a lapse in logic, and this film doesn't suffer from that. Well, certainly not by the examples that they gave. At best it could be 4 minor problems that need some further thinking about on a lazy Sunday afternoon. That's probably too much to put on a thumbnail. But logic, or even lapses of it, aren't the biggest factors in entertainment, let's be honest. Some of the greatest films have plot holes. Cinema's more a visual meth lab than a math lab. We're searching for an emotional experience. And Civil War provides us, the audience, with an emotional journey with these characters that's unusually satisfying for a comic book flick. It works as an action flick, of course, bar the introductory shaky cam and super fast edits, but where it sprints away from the pack is that it provides enough well-written conflict to keep the brain engaged throughout. Yes, this film's developed these characters over 13 films, so the emotional investment at this point's sky high, but this is a masterclass in how to do comic book conflict on screen. For me, the litmus test of a great sequel, though, is not just does it continue the goodwill of preceding episodes. There's a reciprocal relationship going on here. The sequel stands on the shoulders of the originals, but also a great sequel adds more depth to the originals in rewatching. Maybe this is why episode 1 to 3 fared so poorly compared to their originals. It didn't elevate those movies. In fact, it kind of took away some of their mystique. But Civil War hurdles that pitfall and elevates the other films before it. Initially, I wasn't a fan of the first Avenger. I hold my hands up. It was okay, but I just couldn't connect with it like I did with Iron Man. I felt that the time period was a bit disconnected from the greater Marvel Universe, and I didn't warm to the character of Captain America as I'd wanted to. I found him a bit boring. My positive view on Cap was based on Winter Soldier, where they dialed up his badassness up to 10, but on rewatching the first Avenger after Civil War, I fell in love with that film. I'll do a separate review on it, but I loved the character so much under the helmsmanship of the Russos that I craved the backstory, and I watched it with new eyes. It instantly became wholly satisfying. I actually liked Iron Man 2, bar the last 20 minutes, but Civil War's like an elixir to that film. The troubled relationship that Tony has with his father and his father's legacy is just given so much weight in Civil War. It even mends the issues of Tony blowing up the suits in Iron Man 3. Now I'm not going to waste your time just going through the storyline of the film. If you're interested enough to hear me talk about it, just go see it. And if you've already seen it, you don't need me to talk about it. Rather, I just wanted to mention the elements that catapulted this film to the top of the MCU for me. Civil War is conflict on 5 distinct levels. There's the physical confrontation, an ideological confrontation, but also an internal and external emotional conflict and a storyline conflict. And that makes this film amazingly compelling. Christopher Marcus and Steve McFeely, along with the Russos, interweave these 5 conflict levels throughout the film, but the overall arc of all of these films has been wonderfully handled. Let's start with the backstory conflict, which is fascinating. In the first Avenger, Steve Rogers starts out as wanting to be the government guy. He's got the mental and moral convictions to be a hero, but he lacks the physique. Steve has buckets of self-esteem. He's poor, weak, earnest, shy with the ladies. We meet Tony Stark as the definition of the free market entrepreneur. Physically, he's the perfect salesman, but lacks the moral convictions to be a hero. He's dripping in self-confidence. He's rich, capable, glib, a ladies' man. Then they both get marvelized. Steve's weakness is physical, and so that's what he's given. He seems to be a walking advert for the positive effect of steroids if you're mentally and emotionally balanced. I mean, it's called Super Soldier Serum. What else do you think they were alluding to? Tony's weakness is moral, and that's what he's given. He's the original self-helper, building your character. It's beautiful to take the concept of spiritual enlightenment, sometimes depicted as going to a cave somewhere and finding yourself, and giving it the Marvel treatment. He's captured, taken to a cave, and then has to find himself and his purpose in life at gunpoint. Brilliant! But from their very origin stories, they're on opposite sides to each other. Steve doesn't appear to have parental issues. They're dead, but even in the line delivery about them.
What'd your father die of?
Mustard gas. He was in the 107th Infantry. I was hoping I could be assigned.
Your mother?
She was a nurse in a TB ward. Got hit. Couldn't shake it.
There's no angst. It happened, he loved them. Tony has massive unresolved parent issues which continue through the sequels. They're both working in the arena of war, but Steve represents the individual of war, the soldier. Tony represents the business of war. And this is reflected in their codes of war, which evolve throughout the films. It's the code of brotherhood, which is about saving your fellow man, versus the code of owning war, which is about regulation. Steve, with that strong moral compass, has a clear conscience. Tony's haunted by his crises of conscience throughout these films. But over the years, Steve's become distrustful of governments, which we saw play out in Winter Soldier, and so he's arrived at a place in his life where his ideology no longer lines up with his government, or any government. He feels the need to trust his own judgment. He wants the responsibility, because that keeps him honest. Steve's gone from being a child of the government to an adult separate from the government. Tony, on the other hand, has moved towards government oversight because of his moral conflicts. He wants someone else to have to take the responsibility because he doesn't trust his own judgment and he can't handle the consequences of his actions. Tony's gone from being the adult, separate from the government, to wanting to be a child of the government. They're on opposite trajectories. The journeys that they both take make perfect sense logically and are incredibly compelling emotionally. We're invested. So before you even start this film, you've got two completely contrasting characters, both in origin and in background. Wonderfully though, while they differ from in background, they make up for in shared emotions. The emotional conflict rests in the fact that they've got the same strong emotions. Both of them are driven by guilt. Steve's guilty that he wasn't able to save Bucky, his best friend. But on top of that, rather than Bucky dying, he was captured, tortured, and stripped of his very identity and made to do things utterly against his will. He was effectively a POW for 70 years, and Cap left him behind. Tony's driven by guilt. He's a man trying to leave a legacy for the future with the young minds of today, but finding out that he's being personally blamed for the death of one of those minds, a more honourable mind, haunts him. And interestingly, she's actually right about the personal blame because Ultron was Tony's hubris. And when she accuses him of fighting for himself, this echoes Cap's assessment of him in the Avengers.
I've seen the footage. The only thing you really fight for is yourself.
He coped then by challenging Cap physically, but he can't cope with it coming from her. His answer is to turn the aggression inwards. Tony's at war with himself in this film. And once again, he's dealing with his self-esteem, but rather than masking it with bravado as he's done in the past, this time he thinks controlling his teammates while giving up his control to a higher authority will bring him peace. And on top of all that, he still has unsettled emotions about his parents. It's a powerful lesson that true peace comes from controlling ourselves and taking responsibility for our actions. They're both driven by wanting to do the right thing, the best thing. They've just come up with opposing solutions to the same problem. And in this film, we really see a fundamental ideological difference. Choice versus control, and absolutism versus relativism. Bucky losing his choice, losing his free will, drives Steve to keep his and the team's. The death of Charlie Spencer drives Tony to want to abdicate that choice, and having an agency control the Avengers will do that. Vision speaks of controlling the stone and Wanda of controlling her powers, giving them that common ground, but controlling her powers becomes less important to her than having the free will to decide where she can be, causing her to switch sides. Steve is a relativist. His philosophy is, We save as many as we can. That doesn't mean everyone. He accepts the world as it is and tries to do his best. Tony is an absolutist. He wants to make the world perfect, but in that constant search for perfection, he just suffers. And he's not alone. King T'Chaka, speaking for the UN, and therefore the world's mouthpiece for Tony and Ross's side of the equation, says victory at the expense of the innocent is no victory at all. A noble sentiment, but unrealistic. The nature of conflict is that the innocent suffer. These are the realities of the world. There are no answers. They're just pros and cons to both positions. It's circumstances that push us into a philosophy, but as circumstances are always changing, philosophies need to adapt. There are other clever conflicts playing out in the film as well. From simple things like Tony's estrangement from Pepper off-screen compared to Steve's fledgling romance with Sharon Carter on-screen. They're just living completely contrasting lives. But the film also gives us two equally balanced polar opposite villains. Zemo and Ross are the extended evil versions of Tony and Steve. Zemo is the ultimate free agent, an individual without a moral compass. Ross is the ultimate face of government without a moral compass. For me, I thought the Russos did a brilliant job of creating and contrasting these two villains while keeping them operating in the background. As a side point, I find it interesting that as the audience, we only really see the lone gunman as the villain, not the government. Even though blood's been on the government's hands in previous films, as when Ross himself created the abomination that tore up and killed in Harlem, as well as the fact that a council was willing to nuke Manhattan. Ross is also uninterested in the truth and unjustly incarcerates heroes like they're criminals, but he's not really perceived as a villain, more a hard ass. I guess that's the power of authority. Tony's arc in the film is that by the end he regains his self-control. He won't be a government lackey. Allowing Ross's council to take responsibility from him means he'll have to see the world Ross's way. And Tony decides by the end that that's not for him. He realizes that Ross isn't the answer. And through their conflict, they both grow the same way. By the end, they've both become more autonomous. Steve won't work against the Avengers. He'll work with his friends. And he considers Tony one of them. And Tony's not going to mindlessly work under Ross and do his bidding. Hence why he puts him on hold and doesn't care that Steve's broken them out. He smiles. In terms of acting, I have to say that RDJ is phenomenal. The fact that the slightest deviation in delivery of any one of his lines could instantly tip the scales overwhelmingly to Cap, and yet throughout the movie, I'm backing him emotionally as a testimony to great acting. Chris Evans does an amazing job too, but he does have logic, the truth, and the storyline on his side, because Bucky didn't plant the bomb, and he was a victim of mind control when he killed Tony's parents. RDJ doesn't, and in the hands of a lesser actor, it would have felt like a mismatch. Yet I 100% see Tony's point of view and feel his pain throughout. One element I really appreciated in the film was the final fight. While they gave us the ideological fight at the airport, and it was a spectacle to behold, I was so grateful that they then had an intimate, personal, emotional fight at the end. Films like Warrior and the first Rocky are great because the final fight is the physical acting out of an emotional drama. It's not about who wins, it's about the emotional journey. Tony severing that arm that beat his father to death had so much meaning. And the fist fight between himself and Cap had been brewing since the first Avengers film, but actually had been triggered years before. We see a venting of all that jealousy that he felt growing up that his father admired Steve so much. But what rang so true was that Steve had no venom himself. He's protecting his friend to the end, and he won't be bullied by Tony's motivations. But Steve will always do what's right. And what he's really doing is saving Tony from being consumed by his negative emotions. He demonstrates that higher moral value that is at his core by choosing to disarm Tony's suit. Whilst the camera shots of the scene present a choice to up the stakes for the audience, on subsequent viewings you realise there's no choice for Steve. He won't kill Tony. He really is like his big brother. And that is Cap's journey, to visually show Tony the strength of free will and choice. But again, hats off to the writers for that final line by Tony. "You don't deserve it. My dad made that shield," When Tony said it, it hit like a freight train. Whew! Harder than any of those punches. But it was also devastating to hear him drop the shield. That clang sounded the end of the fight. The cost of Steve's choice and free will is that he has to give up being Captain America. He can't represent a country if he represents himself. What a story. From the first Avenger to that. Wow. On successive viewings of the film, the script really shines. The face of government says, compromise and reassurance. That's how the world works. Peggy Carter, a worker for government, is quoted as saying, compromise where you can, but where you can't, don't. And the Winter Soldier's arc is great. There's such a visible change in him over the film. That scene where Steve's looking around his room and there's that loading crate up against the wall, and you can see the pain in Steve's eyes as his friend is living like this now. And the peace that Bucky expresses as he's regained his free will and chooses to go back under. He's literally resting in peace. I'll make a quick mention of some other things. The dynamic of Tony and Peter was great, and a genius move again in the greater storyline of Tony and this parent theme that goes through his character in this film. Spider-Man, by the way, amazing. I can't even work out how they put him in a film, and it just feels so natural to see him there. I loved him on screen, and we know and get why he's there. Peter idolizes Tony Stark. Rich tech genius. Their relationship's perfect. And on the flip side, I like that he had no interaction with Black Panther. Black Panther's there to muddy the waters for Steve, not Tony. And T'Challa, or T'Challa, if you're being linguistically correct, I'm making that up, was the free agent that gave this film its unpredictability. We're really clear with his motivation, revenge, but in many ways he acts as the mirror image to Zemo. With the same circumstances as Zemo, he emerges with high character. They've both lost loved ones and have sought revenge. What I love is there's probably a 30-minute Black Panther film in this film. He spends most of the film hunting down the man he thinks is responsible, but once he realizes, he makes amends by helping the wrongly accused and ensures that the punishment for the real villain isn't swift. It's pretty much a Black Panther prequel short. That's how you introduce a character. I want to make a special mention for Helmut Zemo. I thought he was so well written. His plan is really of the scale of the Joker because he's not superpowered. He's just a man. But they humanize him rather than cartoonize him, which is novel. When he's interrogating the Hydra agent, he tells him of his regret at having to use the book and the bloodier methods. He apologizes to T'Challa for killing his father. He listens to those voice messages throughout the film. These aren't the traits of the garden variety villain. His tools are experience, patience, study. He's more like the antagonist from a play. The final element that I appreciated was that the directors knew when to raise the stakes and when to drop them. That line between Natasha and Clint exemplifies this.
We're still friends, right?
Depends on how hard you hit me.
It would have been ridiculous for these two to have been fighting for real. That nod to the fact that they're just going through the motions with each other lends so much validity to the overall fight. The same with Cap v Spider-Man. It's the interaction that's important, not the actual fight. The respect and acceptance on both sides is what that's really all about. Comedy is more forgiving of inconsistencies in plot than drama, but the Russos don't use comedy to cover up problems. They use it to help the audience gauge the seriousness of the various conflicts in the film. Used well, it aids the action.
You have a metal arm? That is awesome, dude!
Used poorly, and you end up with...
She with you?
I thought she was with you.
Come on, that's the only time I've mentioned the obvious comparisons of these films. And Sam, Scott and Clint's humour is the yin to the yang of Tony and Steve's fight throughout. It allows us the breather, so when it comes time to feel the gravity of the tragedy, like Rhodey's accident, we can feel it. And this is important because it's Tony that so often has provided the comedic beats in this franchise. But even though his role in this is serious, he is so good that he's able to skip effortlessly between comedy and drama in just a few frames. At the airport with
Underoos!
Pete talking, we have the comedy, but in a split second, We go from laughing about his awkwardness to knowing this is deadly serious as Tony says, I'm trying to keep you from tearing the Avengers apart. Pain in his eyes and voice tell us that for these two main characters, this isn't just a rough and tumble, as it is for the other characters. Tony sees himself as the father trying to keep a family together. Steve sees himself as everyone's brother, and he doesn't want a big brother. This film's success lies in the fact that it worked out the logic and the motivations first and foremost in the story. Once you've done that, everything else, action, CG, sets, suit designs, etc., is just bonus. Get a story that makes sense in the world you've placed it in and give the characters emotional reasons to do everything, and you produce a film that's loved by both critics and audiences alike. If you do rewatch the first Avenger and Iron Man 1 and 2, let me know if you enjoyed them more because of Civil War. If you've been entertained, say it with thumbs. Failing that, have your say in the comments, babe. If you like my vibe, please subscribe. Woo! Woo!